Good morning, everyone. It's very good to see you. So, thank you very much for joining us. Thank you very much to Karen for hosting us. And I have a brief biography of Kaitlin, and then she's going to give us her presentation. So, just a bit about the Atmospheric Fund. As a regional climate agency, the Atmospheric Fund invests in low carbon solutions for the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area and helps scale them up for broad implementation. Their Retrofit Accelerator collaborates with building owners, utilities, governments, residents, and stakeholders to minimize project friction and maximize your health, social, environmental, and economic impacts. And just a bit about Kaitlin. So Kaitlin Carroll is the Retrofit Services Manager for the Toronto Atmospheric Fund and their Accelerator Program. She manages deep energy retrofit projects in multifamily buildings across the GTHA. She uses her technical skills and passion for improving IEQ to make homes healthier and more comfortable for building residents. Kaitlin is the former co-chair of the Canada Green Building Council Greater Toronto Chapter's Emerging Green Professionals Committee. Sorry, that's kind of a mouthful. Advocating for students and young professionals in the sustainable building industry. She is also one of Corporate Knights 2018 Top 30 Under 30. Kaitlin is a certified measurement and verification professional in training. She holds a Master's of Building Science from Toronto Metropolitan University and a BA in Environmental Studies from the University of Toronto. So that's quite an impressive resume, Kaitlin, and we're all looking forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you, Sharon, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you for everybody for having me here today. I'm going to be talking about building retrofits for climate action. And I'm going to just kind of talk a little bit about our Retrofit Accelerator and the work that we do. So we had a great introduction there to TAF, but in case you're not familiar with us, we were founded in 1991 with an endowment from the City of Toronto, and we've since then been able to expand our work through subsequent endowments from the province of Ontario as well as the federal government. And our mandate is climate change mitigation. So we do that through policy advocacy, investing in different companies, projects that are focused on decarb, providing grants to nonprofits or municipalities, and as well as running our own programs. So one of those key programs is a Retrofit Accelerator, where I work. We launched this 3 years ago. And basically, the Retrofit Accelerator is there to support owners of multi-res buildings to navigate the deep retrofit process. Just in case you're not familiar, multi-res buildings is basically like condos, apartment buildings, townhouse complexes, just places where there are many families living. And deep retrofit, that can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people, but for us, we're looking at specifically 40% or more emissions reductions, and we're looking at basically heading on the path to net zero. So I'll talk more about TAF's retrofit specifically. We have over a decade of experience working on these multi-res retrofits and providing this sort of model for end-to-end delivery services. We have retrofitted over 3,000 homes. Largely those were in social housing, but there were some as well to date in condos and in rental apartments. We've collected literally millions of data points as part of our monitoring. That's kind of a project that is dear to my heart. We do monitoring, research, and optimization work in all of our buildings. And as was kind of mentioned by Sharon, the word IEQ came up in my bio. IEQ is indoor environmental quality. So that's things like your thermal comfort, your air quality, stuff like that. So that's part of kind of our research. And this retrofit work that we've been doing over the past decade has provided the foundation to develop the Retrofit Accelerator. There are 3 key retrofit barriers that I want to talk about today, just to kind of give you an idea of the challenges that are out there in the industry. And I'll talk a little bit later about the ways that the accelerator hopes to address these. So the first one is financial. There are still high upfront costs and long payback periods in going towards deep retrofits. One of the reasons for this is that gas is still relatively inexpensive, and that kind of makes a business case challenging for electrification projects. However, we know that from like a GHG perspective, we need to get away from gas. So that's one kind of key barrier. And then the next barrier would be organizational. So the project complexity and the perceived risk. Deep retrofits and electrification projects, they are complex. They're not business as usual, replacing like for like. And so not all building owners necessarily feel like they have the capacity to confidently manage these projects. And they might perceive the risk of the project as being greater than it is because, again, it's unfamiliar to them. And then the next one would really be the market capacity, which I think is one of the larger struggles, is that the market is still underdeveloped for these type of retrofits. It's not easy to find retrofit partners that have the skills needed to succeed at a deep retrofit at a reasonable price. And from an economics perspective, the supply of highly qualified retrofit service providers is not, relative to the high number of buildings that need support. So we definitely want to see market transformation and change there. There might be other barriers, obviously, but these are kind of the key ones, and most things can kind of fit into these categories. So in speaking to the barriers, we should also speak to how we believe the barriers can be addressed. And that kind of takes us to the theory of change for the Retrofit Accelerator. Through the Retrofit Accelerator, we are generating retrofit scale to help build capacity and develop an efficient market for the deep retrofits. It might sound strange to say this, but ideally, there's no need for a Retrofit Accelerator to exist in 10 years because we've done such a good job that now the market can provide everything the building owner needs. So we've created a program that we hope is obsolete in about a decade or less. Our approach right now with the Retrofit Accelerator allows us to compress costs through aggregation, standardization, and eventually industrialization. And we measure and highlight the social and climate benefits of the work, which helps then inform the policy advocacy. And the last part here is the policy drivers. So all of that work creates the foundation for policy changes that are necessary to decarbonize our buildings in the timelines that we need to see happen. And we won't be able to decarbonize our buildings without equal parts carrots and sticks, which is a little bit of conversation we were just having at the beginning of this. So with that in mind, I'll talk a little bit about the existing policy landscape, and hopefully that will just shed some light on where we're at. So at the beginning of this year, I believe the city has started to set out to require reporting and disclosure of energy and water use for buildings. So this is already required by the province through something called EWRB, or Energy and Water Reporting Benchmarking. But participation in the provincial program has not been the greatest to date. So the city is requiring reporting of buildings larger than 50,000 square feet starting this year, and all buildings larger than 10,000 square feet starting in 2025. And annual energy use reporting allows building owners and also the public to kind of track where building performance is over time. And it also allows us to have valuable data that's necessary to create sort of benchmarks that we can track performance against, as well as, for example, if you have a sister building or if there's other similar buildings in your portfolio, there's a lot of different ways that you can look at your data and compare it to other buildings and understand where you're at. This is a really important first step in improving building performance over time. You can't manage what you don't measure is I think like a key phrase that we hear in the industry. So like just being able to get that information is very exciting and very important for change. And building performance is going to have to improve. So the city is working on developing something called BPS, or Building Performance Standards, which we've seen happening already in places like New York and Vancouver. So BPS is a transformational policy that will require larger buildings to meet specific emissions performance reductions, or they're going to have to pay a financial penalty for each ton of carbon emissions exceeding the requirement. So BPS are critical to meeting our climate goals as there aren't enough incentives for buildings to decarbonize fast enough otherwise. So we do need to have, again, the carrot and the stick, as this example shows. And this policy is going to allow for gradual mandatory compliance over time with plenty of time for planning. So they want to make sure that it's very accessible to folks. And then the last thing that I want to talk about on the existing policy landscape is cooling bylaws or maximum temperature bylaws. This is something that is already happening, for example, in Hamilton, it's being considered. And we expect to see these becoming a reality in the next 5 years or so as the climate continues to warm. So essentially what it would be is that there would be a maximum temperature at which building owners would be able to maintain their buildings predominantly in the summer. And this is just because we've seen with the tragedies in Vancouver, Montreal, and even locally, the risk of summer overheating and the impacts that has on mortality and morbidity is quite it's quite real, and it's going to continue to be real as the climate warms. So it's really important that we're looking at these sort of bylaws that not only impact energy, but they also protect people's health. And so with BPS, just going back to it, that could actually help indirectly address the cooling issue because heat pumps are the most efficient way to decarbonize your building, and heat pumps also provide cooling. So we're just starting to see like a lot of synergies between the health realm and the climate realm. And I will speak a little bit to what the Retrofit Accelerator does. Here's kind of a high level, but I'll go into each piece of this. So our first real mandate is originating retrofits. So a lot of the work we do is just trying to get retrofit projects to happen. We do outreach to building owners, we do outreach to municipalities, to social housing providers, basically anybody who has a building. And we offer one of the first steps would be like co-funding preliminary studies and audits for building owners that are serious about tackling deep energy retrofits. The reason we do co-funding instead of just straight up funding is because we want to ensure that the building owners have some sort of stake in the game, that they're serious about transforming these studies into real projects, rather than just looking for free audits and not making any changes afterwards. Briefly put up here enhanced reserve fund studies or special reserve fund studies. I'm going to speak to that at the end because it's very specific to condos, but that's another type of service that we're looking at expanding. And we always look for opportunities for aggregation. So if you have a building portfolio, it's just a lot easier for us to work with maybe multiple buildings in your portfolio at once because you can aggregate for cost compression and time compression. So we do provide funding and financing support outside of just like our own funding that we have available. One of the things we do is help building owners understand the true business case for retrofits. So moving from life cycle cost assessment to total cost of building ownership. We identify and keep track of grants and financing opportunities for specific different building types so that we can offer that up to folks. And we support the application processes for those financing opportunities, like we can co-write applications, provide letters of support, we can partner on applications as well. So that's the ways in which we try to help building owners mobilize. And we also connect with building owners, connect them with financing partners. So for example, private lenders like Efficiency Capital. Guiding building owners is also a large portion of our work. So we provide support for resident engagement, which includes pre and post retrofit resident surveys. So those surveys ask things such as, how do you feel in your apartment? Is it too hot, too cold in this season, in that season? What sort of equipment do you use? Do you use an air conditioner, et cetera, to kind of get down to where the opportunities for an energy retrofit could be based on the things that people are experiencing. Because often what you're experiencing, whether it's making you uncomfortable, whether it's, whether the smells coming from your neighbor are bothering you, these can all actually be because of problems with the building, such as poor ventilation, such as a need to introduce cooling. So we kind of ask questions around that, and we do indoor environmental quality monitoring studies, and we create a lot of materials for residents for awareness and training. For example, how can you use your new heat pump? We would help provide sort of education around that. And we also love to just participate in town halls, info sessions, and anything that's engaging residents on their building and their energy use. We also provide procurement and contracting support if that's needed. We'll review any sort of construction work and design materials. We'll provide project management support. I think you heard in my introduction that I'm something called a Certified Measurement and Verification Professional in Training. It's a very long title, which basically means I look at building performance before and after the retrofit, and I just compare how well we're doing and help identify performance issues and help them optimize the system. So just really looking at the numbers. And the last thing that I really have to point out is because we are a nonprofit, all of our services are offered for free. We don't ask for anything in return. We really just want to make these building projects happen. Last point here on the Retrofit Accelerator on what we do is just knowledge sharing. It's huge. If you go to our website, you can find a bunch of different case studies on different buildings. If that interests you, definitely check it out. We try to innovate on retrofit delivery and contracting. We're using something called integrated project delivery right now on a Toronto community housing retrofit. And we found that building owners are actually more willing to innovate when we're involved in a retrofit. Because we can assume some of the risk. And that kind of goes back to the barrier that I mentioned earlier, really just helping people take the jump to move away from business as usual and move away to practices that are going to get them better outcomes. We try to introduce social procurement into all of our projects. So we work with social enterprises like Building Up. They're a social contractor based in Toronto that provides training opportunities in the construction industry for people facing barriers to employment. It's really important to us to see that happen. And last but not least, we undertake specific market development activities to help inform our own retrofits as well as projects undertaken by other organizations and building owners. So for an example, this year we worked with Dunsky to create a study on the benefits and challenges of heat pump bulk procurement and aggregation. So we're really focusing on that last market development piece. I'm just going to put our criteria out there in case any of you folks are interested, but we are looking for multi-residential buildings in the GTHA. They should be 4 stories or more above ground, or have a building footprint of at least 600 meters square, or be a townhouse complex with a similar footprint at least, and targeting a minimum 40% emissions reduction. And then the nice to haves, if the key systems are nearing end of life, because that really means that you're ready to do a retrofit, right? You have the opportunity there, and this is the best time for us to get in and help you make that choice that's going to be energy conscious and decarb conscious. And then if the buildings are at least 20 years old, we typically end up working in buildings that are around 1960s, 70s. That's a large portion of the apartment building stock in Toronto. But condos are often more newer and towards the 20 years old mark. So with that in mind, I was asked to discuss condos specifically, as it might be of interest to a lot of the folks here. So I'm actually going to go through a case study of one of the condo retrofits we recently did. It's a little hard to say, FQSF, or French Quarter Shared Facilities. It's a condo 11-story building. It's 2 separate buildings. You can see them in the background of the slide there, 1 and 2, located at 120 Lombard in downtown Toronto. You might see it if you pass by. And this project was recently profiled in the Toronto Star. So if you've read that article, you might be a little familiar with what I'm about to say. The building has existing hydronic heating. So they have fan coils in each unit. They have a chiller on the roof, and they have gas heating. And this is our first condo retrofit success story. I won't lie, working in condos can be challenging. I'll get into a little bit about that later, but this is our first condo success story, as well as our first Klima Veneta installation. So we really worked hard with the board here to make this happen, and the board did a great job of getting the owners on board. And they were also willing to take a chance on the first commercial installation of Mitsubishi's Klima Veneta heat pump system in Canada. It's also our first air-to-water heat pump project. We typically do a lot of air-to-air heat pump projects, but it's a very flagship and important project to us. So I've been throwing around some technical terms. So I'll speak a little bit to what an air-to-water heat pump is. So air-to-water heat pumps, and really any heat pump, the way that they work is that they move heat from one place to another. So in the winter, even though it's really cold outside, a heat pump will essentially take heat from that outdoor air and bring it into your home to heat your space. Then in the summer, it's going to do the opposite. It's going to take the heat that's in your space and it's going to reject it outside so that it's cooler in your space. And for an air-to-air heat pump, that would be air on both sides, but in this case, it's air to water. So it's taking heat from the air and it's transferring it through the water piping, transferring the heat and the energy through the water piping. So that's how we're conditioning the building. So large air-to-water heat pump systems are ideal for existing hydronic systems, existing water-based systems, as they can distribute heat and cooling using the same water-based system already in place in the building. You don't have to repipe the entire building. And they can also be a drop-in replacement for a chiller. So it's ideal in a retrofit situation in a condo because a lot of condos actually have cooling provided, which is a little bit different than a lot of the other building stock in Toronto. And so there's a great opportunity here for you to have a chiller, which is at the end of life, which is the scenario that happened with this building, and replace it with this air-to-water heat pump instead, which is more efficient. And so the new heat pump can be sized to meet the existing cooling needs of the building and still offset a significant portion of the gas used for space heating. Or another alternative, the system can be sized to remove the gas heating system entirely, or only keep that gas heating system as a backup. So those are just a couple of options. Again, it's going to depend on your building, but there are definitely different configurations to think about. So what happened here at our case study building? The condo board knew that they had a very old chiller that was nearing the end of life. It needed to be replaced. The easiest thing to do would be replace it with like for like I said. However, the new members on the board actually saw this as an opportunity to reduce their carbon emissions and instead pursued air-to-water heat pump replacements for the chiller. And the board decided to here size the system to meet 100% of their cooling needs and almost all of their space heating needs. And this is what we call a hybrid system because the gas boiler was left in place to provide supplemental heating and backup heating wherever needed. And what was the key motivating factor behind this? It was actually the champions that we had on the board. This approach was more expensive than just replacing like for like, but the board felt the additional cost was justified by the benefits of the emissions reductions. They engaged the condo owners throughout the process, and key members of the board really championed the project and made it happen. In our experience, these projects do not happen without champions who are determined to see the project to success. And because the board members also wanted to showcase this project and really market it as how can we be first in class? How can we be the first ones doing this? How can we be education to other condos in Toronto? They are actually really amazing. They've allowed us to give multiple site tours to different interested parties, and they've met with other condo boards to try and help them do something similar. So it's really a great educational piece as well. I'm sure that everybody is wondering about the costs because it's really important. The total cost was $567,000. The board has not been shy about making these numbers public, so I can share them with you. The net cost here shown was after a modest contribution from TAF as well as support from IESO and Enbridge incentives. However, when we're looking at these retrofits and we're looking at decarbonization, I think it's really important to consider the incremental costs. As I said, chiller, end of life, you need to replace it anyways. So this is money that was going to be spent. The incremental cost is only 166,000. So they really, if you want to consider it, that's kind of a small price to pay considering the significant ability to reduce their carbon emissions and natural gas consumption that followed after installing the system. And we're looking at incremental costs. If we split it over the unit, it's just slightly over $1,000. At the end of all of this work, we are not done working with MQSF yet. There's some additional work that we want to do. For example, introducing a BAS or a building automation system, a new one that will actually allow the condo to monitor and control multiple building systems at once, including the heat pump. And I think we also want to do a little additional optimization work, which I'll show on, I think, the next slide. Okay, so here we're going to talk about the performance. We have been monitoring this building's performance closely with the help of the TRCA STEP team. So TRCA is a Toronto Regional Conservation Authority, and they have a Sustainable Technologies Evaluation Program. That's STEP. Definitely, if you're interested, check out STEP, Google them, and see their website because they also have a lot of great details and case studies similar to TAF. They're very detailed and thorough in their work. So if you are a numbers person, check out their website and take a look at that. But for us, because this is a complex system, we really brought them on board so that they could help us with the more complex monitoring. And preliminary results, we're still, in that first year, our analysis isn't finalized, and we're still doing optimization, but we have a COP of approximately 2.5. So a COP is a coefficient of performance, and that is essentially saying for every kilowatt hour of electricity consumed by the system, how much heating energy is it putting out? So 2.5 is pretty significant. It means the system is pretty efficient. Typical systems, if you're looking at like a electric radiator, it's not going to go above 1, and gas systems can be even slightly below 1. So we're looking at 2.5. It's a great improvement from what they had before. And this is a hybrid system. So the gas boilers were still kept in place for supplemental heating or heating when it's really cold outside. However, the heat pumps are doing the large majority of the space heating, and we've seen a 76% reduction in space heating gas consumption so far. But as I said, there's still room for improvement. We want to continue to optimize the system. We want to get that new BAS in that will help us have more understanding of how different pieces of the building are working together. So we expect these numbers, particularly, I think the 76%, could increase in the following years. All right. So what I really wanted to talk about today is how you folks here can make a difference, particularly for those of you who might be owners of condos or owner residents of condos. I will preface this by saying I do not live in a condo. So I'm not as familiar with all the ins and outs of condo life as, some of the lovely people that I've been talking here today are. But this is really what I've seen from my experience in just working with condo retrofits. A successful deep retrofit in condos really depends on the owner buy-in. Depending on your condo structure, your bylaws, there's generally some sort of voting required to make large changes to the building. So without that buy-in, like these projects cannot go forward. So one thing that you can just do from the start is, either establish or become part of your condo's environmental committee or energy committee, whatever it might be called. Find the right opportunity there. That's a very strong first step. Almost all the condo work we've done to date has come from resident owners who want to make a difference in their buildings, and they are in some way either part of the board or part of a committee that responds and informs the board. Board and owner engagement is going to be paramount. You need to plan and execute that engagement very well. You need to provide owners with clear and effective messaging around the project goals and outcomes. And you need to connect early and often through a variety of communication avenues so nobody gets left out. I'm sure like in your buildings, there are a variety of people who, you interact with in different ways. And it's making sure that, we're having this great conversation earlier as well, but this is people's homes, right? And so people, they are sensitive to the changes that are going to be happening in their home. And I think it's really important to make sure that you engage and that all people who are working on the project, whether it's TAF, whether it's our contractors, etc., that they engage with the residents in a way that makes them feel heard. And that can really go a long way to getting people to understand the message around decarbonization. And then specific to condos, I want to talk about this enhanced reserve fund study or special reserve fund study. We're trying to determine the correct title. It's something that we're interested in. We've seen that condo owners and even some equity co-ops who do reserve fund studies are showing interest in this. But essentially for condos, my understanding is that you have a regular reserve fund that there are a couple of different levels, and every couple of years you do a rather in-depth one. And the reserve fund covers, sort of the plan for how you will use those funds to do different building, maintenance and improvements over the coming projection. With that, a lot of great information is already being looked at by a lot of talented engineers, usually when those reports are being done. So why not take that opportunity and then provide a focus on decarbonization pathways for the next 30 years? You're already getting the base work done. So that's why we're considering this sort of special or enhanced. It's an improvement. It's kind of an add-on. It can be done in tandem with a typical RFS as part of your usual cycle, particularly if you don't have any urgent pressing systems at end of life. It could be good to just look at this, get these projections, understand where the opportunities are going to go. And these studies should really take into account the things that I talked about at the start around BPS and the transition away from gas, and what are the potential consequences if we go with a like-for-like system, or if we don't make these changes and then certain policies are implemented and now there's certain mandates that we have to adhere to. So really just getting that long-term sort of projection, it's the first step in providing the information and the momentum needed for additional decision-making on decarbonization measures. I don't think there's any condo board that wants to go forward with a decarb measure without at least seeing some sort of, scientific engineering study showing what the impacts and the benefits are going to be. But you're already doing RFS work anyways. So here's a way to just bring that all together. If there is anybody who is interested in that, I'm going to put my contact information at the end. If you are on a condo board, definitely reach out, because as I said, this is something new. We're kind of in the phase of piloting this currently. So we'd love to hear from more condos and get their take on if they think this is something that would really make changes for them. So that takes me to most of my content slides. I just want to briefly show some of the incentive and funding programs that are out there. These are programs outside of TAF. So if you have questions about them, definitely check their website. I believe that my slides will be circulated at the end, so you don't have to necessarily rush to write these down, but just in case, I just want to bring them up. There are, a couple of programs here: FCM, Sustainable Affordable Housing Program, financing up to 80% of retrofit costs to 10 million. That's something that we're looking at right now. CMHC Affordable Greener Homes, Greener Affordable Homes, program. Looking at pretty intense energy targets, 70% energy and 80% GHG reductions. And funding up to 100% of the eligible costs up to 170K per unit. That's in the social housing. Then we have a couple of programs that are more open. So we have CMHC MLI Select, it's for apartment buildings. We have the Clean Technology in Investor Tax Credit. It's for apartments and taxable entities. It's a tax credit up to 30% for installing renewable energy or ground or air source heat pumps. And we also have the Canada Infrastructure Bank aggregator funding for privately owned multi-res and commercial buildings. It's requiring a minimum 30% of GHG reductions and financing up to 80% of project costs. So these are great programs out there. And then specifically, if you are in the city of Toronto, the city of Toronto has a couple of different programs. They have Taking Action on Tower Renewal, they have High Rise, and they have their Energy Retrofit Loan Program. The first two are specific to MERBs, and I think the third one, it says also, I think single family housing might be also included, but again, please check the website for details. But yeah, there are definitely things out there. So if you are interested, take a look at these websites, and you can always take this information, even if you live in an apartment building. I don't want you to feel discouraged. I know I focus largely on condos, but even if you live in an apartment building, there is just so much power in being informed and taking that information to, the folks who are there. And if they can see the business case, they might want to take action. So, sorry, that's it. That's me. This is my closing slide. My contact information is here. Our Retrofit Accelerator website is there as well. There's a form on the website. If you do have a building project, you can submit through the form. And I believe I was also asked to mention that if you go to taf.ca, you can sign up for our newsletter that I know some folks on the call have already read today. So if you like that content, it's there. Yeah, that's it. Sorry. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation, Kaitlin. You raised a lot of very interesting points, and I'm hoping we're going to get some good questions to clarify it. So now, Gary, go ahead.
Okay. Thank you. That was very helpful. I live in a condo not far from the French Quarter, and unfortunately, about 4 or 5 years ago, we replaced all our chillers on the roof. But ever optimistic, I'm wanting to be ready for the next time, or if they fail early or something like that. And I wanted to ask you, is there any way to mitigate the risk of being an early adopter? Like the French Quarter people have the first and only Mitsubishi, I think it is, and what if that thing's a bit of a lemon? That could be a real problem, and it would damage the whole reputation of the plan. So is there anything for us keeners who want to get in there early and do something fast, like there really is an emergency?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. It's a little hard to answer, but I think for us at TAF, like specifically with our work, we are looking to pilot these technologies that, as you say, are very sort of new and up and coming. Although I will say that with the technologies that we're piloting, like, yes, it is the first in Canada. It's not the first in the world, right? Like the technologies that we work with are already established in, other countries, especially Europe and such. So they're not like brand new technologies per se. It's more like new to our market. That's kind of the sweet spot that we work in. But Canadian climate is different than Europe, obviously. So we do often find, sometimes there are challenges. And that's why for us, when we are on a project, I mentioned about that optimization and commissioning. It's really about sticking through, getting that data for that first year, understanding what's going on in the systems. And a lot of it is, it usually comes down to the point that it's not that the equipment itself is bad. It's just like this is a slightly different type of installation. And so working with engineers, working with the project team to optimize over time will help you get over those hurdles. And so that's why we want to stay with the project to make sure that we see the project success. I'm not sure.
So sorry, just before Michael goes, so you do stay with the project to make sure that it's working well?
We generally will be with the project for at least that 1 year. Because I think for any systems, like you need to see those whole 12 months, all those seasons. You need to kind of see how that's performing to understand. So we're generally with each project for at least 1 year. Sometimes maybe it's 2, maybe it's more. It depends on the type. Yeah.
Okay, Michael, go ahead.
So one of the words that keeps popping up is market. And you mentioned right at the beginning that part of the problem is that there are insufficient numbers of companies engaged in this work, which would be then a more competitive environment and lower the price and the cost of retrofits and so on. And I'm wondering if TAF has ever had this kind of discussion about the market, because I think, of course, in my view, anyhow, that the market got us to this place. Climate collapses because of the market. And we don't seem to have any mechanism for influencing or managing the market in order to speed up change so that the climate emergency is tackled quickly. And if we sit around and wait for the market, it seems to me that the opportunity to really quickly move forward on exactly the work that TAF is doing is going to be hindered. And I'm wondering if TAF has ever discussed that with politicians, with anybody who can start thinking in those terms. Like when I think about water systems, we created municipal public-owned water systems because we needed water. We do social housing publicly because we need social housing. But when it comes to the climate emergency, we leave it to the market, and it's not working. And I'm wondering, it just seems to me that it has to be a conversation that organizations like yours and municipal governments push other levels of government to address, because it's all too slow.
No, that's a great point. And market change is, as I think I touched on it, how I feel it's maybe one of the more difficult issues of the 3 that I put on that slide, right? It does feel quite slow, and it can be a little demoralizing, but I also think that there are a lot of opportunities out there in this space. I think there are a lot of actors who are looking to make those opportunities happen. And we do have at TAF a policy division who speaks more towards the policy side. Can't speak towards that too in depth, as it's not really the core of my work, but what we try to do, at least from the accelerator side and the project side, is we try to send signals, I guess, to the market to help these things industrialize and grow. So we want to really look at how we can aggregate. That's why I talked about the Dunsky study on aggregating heat pump procurement. How can we aggregate other types of, building building retrofit measures, essentially. That's really on the top of our mind right now, because I think if we can send messages to the market to say, like, hey, there's business opportunities here, like we have these buildings and they want to do this, people will hopefully like start to innovate and move in that direction. And this is a little two-pronged, because as you're saying, like the policy, like it's so important to do that as well. I feel like we have to kind of take it from both sides just to make sure that when there's a sticking point on one part, we're really getting at it from the other. Does that sort of answer your question?
Yes, it does. That's really helpful. Thanks.
Okay, before we go to Carolyn, who is next, there is a question in the chat from Liz. A great presentation. Question for the Lombard property. Did the $567,000 cost include any envelope improvements to make the building more energy efficient? And do any of the support programs focus on envelope improvement?
So that did not include envelope improvements in that specific project, but this is a really good question. We are very concerned with envelope improvements, and for the reasons you've outlined here, bringing down the heating and cooling load. I do believe that a number of the programs I showed would cover envelope improvements. It's going to be case by case. For example, I don't like the ITC, the investor tax credit does not. I would go refer to each of their individual websites to clarify, but I am aware that at least some of those we are working with them, so they would cover envelope improvements. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. Okay, Carolyn, you're next.
Yes, I'm just wondering if I'm from the Waterloo region, so I'm wondering if there is an agency such as yours in this region or anywhere else in Ontario, or are you unique?
Great question. They're in Ontario. So we do have a number of LC3 centers. They're scattered across the country. And I think there are a number of retrofit accelerators popping up. I can't speak specifically to Waterloo off the top of my head. I know that there is Enviro Center who is also active in Ontario, and I'm not sure how big their catchment area is. They're primarily in Ottawa, but if you want to send me an email, maybe I can get back to you on that. Just not sure off the top of my head, sorry.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, Gary, go ahead.
In the French Quarter, the gas heating was kept as a backup system. If and when that fails, is there an option, or is there a possibility that they won't need to replace it if the heat pump from the water is working well in the weather they've had?
That is a great question. I don't necessarily have the ability to answer that because that would take some engineering studies. We are optimizing and seeing good numbers, but they're still using some gas on site. Not sure if they would need to then transfer to perhaps an electric boiler or some other type of backup system, just to hit those really cool days, like really winter days. I can't answer that because, I would need to see the engineering reports, but it's a great question. And, I think we are aiming as much to get gas out of buildings as much as possible, but there are times when it's just not possible for the business case and it's just not possible for that specific building. And so I think in this case, seeing a 76% reduction in their gas use made more sense than, holding off and seeing no reduction in that gas use. So that's kind of why we went with that.
Mm-hmm. And is there advice you have about condos or for condos on how to aggregate with neighbors, neighboring condo buildings? Because there's lots around where we live.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think it's going to depend on the condo agreements. But I would love to see that. It's something like maybe like a district energy or just straight up aggregation of what they're doing. That would be a dream for me. That makes me feel really excited, but we haven't gotten there yet,
Thank you.
Karen?
Kaitlin, just to Gary's question about staying on gas or having any gas, what does the emergency generator do? Is it not? I mean, I think you need to have some capacity. That's one thing. And the other reason I understand that there's some gas is the temperature and getting to a temperature in which your heat pump isn't as effective. Is that the reason for keeping some gas?
I think it's largely the second point that you've mentioned, just when, Toronto's design temperature is like -20 or 21, something like that. And so the heat pumps might have diminished performance when it goes that low, which is, for those of us who live in Toronto, we know that's pretty rare, but it still happens sometimes. So I think that's kind of the point where we're at. And also, to a certain degree, I think even though we're getting cold climate air source heat pumps and stuff, I think there's still just that whole perceived risk aspect. So like speaking to maybe other projects where the heat pump could provide 100% of the load and was sized correctly, sometimes there's still a perceived risk. So we've done some air source heat pump projects where we've these were in electric buildings, but we've left the electric baseboards in place, for example, on the very, very, very off chance that there's an issue and they need to be turned on. And usually in those cases, the other reason we leave them is because it's a significant additional cost to remove and rip out all the baseboards. So we usually sometimes keep backup systems. So I would say in general, keeping backup systems, whether they're gas or electric, it's still pretty common. And the reason is largely just that perceived risk and keeping it backup.
Mhm. Great, thank you. And just a quick question on building envelopes. What's the major envelope issue for buildings? Is it windows more than anything, or?
I think it's case by case, depending on what your envelope structure is, how old your windows are. If you have like single pane, really old windows, like we know some buildings that have, there are some buildings that have no insulation, like no insulation in the walls, just so it depends on the building, how old it is, what the construction's like. We want to look a lot at this idea of, I'm not sure if you're familiar with panelized overcladding, because a lot of TAF's work, we want to keep the residents in place. You know, we don't want to disrupt them. We don't want them to have to move out and move into a hotel. So we're looking at panelized overcladding, which is essentially like a new wall that will go over the existing wall. So that you will not have to leave your home, and they can be often fitted off-site depending on how they're built, or fitted on-site with new windows as well. And just like bringing out that wall from what is maybe a fairly slender, not insulated wall to like a more insulated, more energy efficient wall. So we have some upcoming projects that will be looking at that. I'm just sure we'll have case studies on them once those projects come to like full fruition. I think they're in like starting construction phase. But definitely look up panelized overcladding if that's interesting, if you like envelope, which I do.
So could I ask you, just talking about the overcladding brought to mind, so how long, what's the time frame for, like, from, I know there's a lot of buildup. You talked about some of the steps, but let's say you're ready to go. You've got the project passed, you found the supplier, you found the people who are going to install it. So once that starts, what kind of timeline are we talking about?
Yeah, I think once construction is typically not one of the longest phases. You would be surprised. So again, I can't quote specifics because it would depend on what the work is being done. But
so sort of, do you have a range? Like, is it, I don't know, I'm choosing this out of the air, but say 3 months to 18 months, or longer than that, or shorter than that?
I'd say definitely not shorter than 3 months, but you know, a lot, it depends. If it's just like a heat pump project, maybe that's just gonna happen in the summer, you know, the couple summer for 4 months and get that installed. If it's more intense, like we have overcladding, we have heat pumps, there's a lot of sequencing that would go into it. So that would be critical. But we do look with like the integrated project delivery. It's all about how you can shorten and compress those timelines as much as possible by doing more upfront work, making sure that the designs are more sound, doing investigative work on site, like literally, okay, if we have to pull out this wall to make sure what's going on in this wall, like we're going to do that. We're going to do a mock suite so that we know that this person, that person all know when they're coming in. So we use those type of strategies to compress the timeline as much as possible. Of course, sometimes there are things that are outside of your hands, like if you are ordering the equipment and it's not in the country, that could create a barrier. But construction is typically not as long as the lead up to construction and design. You want to put a lot of your time and effort into getting that design right. and just making your construction go.
Okay, I was only thinking about that because we were talking about resistance. Sometimes inconvenience to people when the project is actually going on. Sometimes that's one of the barriers too. So I was just thinking, like you, that the better you plan in advance, the shorter the time when people are inconvenienced.
Yeah, and I think that's especially true with like in-suite work. So like the envelope stuff might be happening on the outside. It's still inconvenience, I understand, but like particularly the in-suite work, trying to get that done like in one person's suite in a couple of days only. So like heat pumps are actually fairly straightforward to install these days, really like short timeline for that. But again, it's hard to speak to a project without a project in front of me, sorry.
You've talked about a number of different programs. Is there any possibility of combining them? Like Toronto Atmospheric Fund does something, Transform TO does something. Is there any, or if we go with TAF, that's it. We can't look anywhere else.
No, yeah, so that's a great question to clarify. So we love to work together with people. So it's definitely not like if you work with us, you can't work with other people. And one of the things is like with a lot of those kind of funding that I showed at the end, we want to help you apply for that funding. To make sure that your application is successful. And I do believe, again, it would depend on the funding program, but a lot of those are also stackable from my understanding. And then similarly, I'm not sure about exactly the program Gary was referring to, but with the city services, we do work closely with them. And in fact, they sometimes bring us projects, we bring them projects. So I would say that in this sort of industry right now, everybody is fairly cooperative. So that's been really nice. And it's great getting to work with other people and hear from their experience as well.
That's really good to hear too.
Yeah.
As Michael was mentioning, for instance, about the market, that definitely encourages the market, but it also means that you all learn from one another, and I think that's terrific.
I have a more granular question. I'm very interested in the panelized overcladding. Does any of that mimic the appearance of a brick heritage building?
Oh, yes. So I can't speak to specific brands, but there are brands out there that I have seen, and they can do really custom facade types that just look very realistic and very beautiful. So I would say just have a look at who's out there and see, but there's definitely lovely brick facades. Even there are some buildings that I've seen in downtown Toronto, the yellow brick, which is it has like a specific historical significance, I guess, in this area as well. But I've seen facade that can mimic that as well, which maybe because it's so important to keep our like cultural sort of aesthetic that we have.
And is there an issue with property lines with the city property? Like if you want to bump your building out 6 inches to insulate it and it comes into the airspace of the city, is that a no-no?
I think there can be property line issues. It would have to be dealt with case by case, and I think you might be able to apply for an easement. I don't work a lot in permitting, but definitely when our engineers are looking at these projects, like one thing that they have to consider, they have to look at is the property line. And sometimes there are tight property lines, right? And sometimes you're adding a significant amount to this wall. So it's a very good question. Case by case, and you would probably have to apply for an easement if there was an issue.
I think there's a longer term benefit for, in particular, if you're living in a condo, and the fact that you're enhancing your building makes it a more attractive place to live. So there's some financial benefits that way over a longer term. And I also think that the more you can build in the potential for cost savings going forward for owners, the easier it might be to bring reluctant people along. And for sure, we know that gas is going to be incredibly volatile going forward. And while the costs are low now, I've seen lots of projections for much, much higher costs going forward. So I think there's more room to encourage people to move in this direction by thinking about the costs and articulating them.
Yeah, I do agree.
Okay, so from Caroline in Waterloo in the chat, she says, I did find a sustainability co-lab that addresses these issues in my region. Again, I will include this in the summary of this, www.sustainabilitycolab.org. And one final question about the insurance, because Liz is the one who asked. I've heard about homeowners who can't get insurance after they've had their gas connection cut. I have to say I didn't know that, because the insurer believes that heat pumps can't keep the home warm enough.
It's the first time that I've heard that as well. Yeah, this is my first time hearing that, Liz. Interesting. I'll definitely look more into this insurance issue. As I said, it doesn't usually come up in our project discussions, but maybe is this like specifically dealing with a single family home as well? I'll definitely look more into the insurance issue if that's of interest, and maybe I can come back with something for the group in an email.
It's
Liz?
single family, just
Single
to
family.
clarify.
Okay.
But
Sorry.
it
Yeah.
does sound like maybe the policy unit of TAF might look into that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely more of a policy thing. But now I'm curious that you brought this up to my attention, so I'm gonna poke around.
So thank you very, very much, Kaitlin. This has really been very helpful. Thank you.
Thank
I
you.
am Kaitlin,
Absolutely fabulous. Thanks.
very patient, and you've given us a lot of information, and you've been very patient in answering all our questions.
I just was saying it's been great. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. Awesome.
Coming,
Thank you,
Kaitlin.
everyone. Yeah. Thank you for having me.